Welcome to I'm a voice for creators. I'm your host, Daniel Norton. And in this episode, we're going to actually address the idea of ego. And this comes from a email I got from Graeme. I'll read his email. We'll talk a little bit about how we can use our ego maybe to our advantage and also make sure it's not to our disadvantage. And for those of you on Spotify, you may have noticed that this episode is a video podcast. So Anchor has given us access to the video podcast platform. And from now on, if you are listening on Spotify, you can also see a video. Everybody else who's listening on other platforms, it should be the same for you. Let me know, send me a message or an email and let me know if anything has changed. It shouldn't, but technology, right? We'll figure that out. So before we get into the show though, let's hear a review. All right. This review comes from Bashtord. It's from 315, A Voice of Creation. I have long been a fan of Daniel Norton's YouTube broadcasts, and I'm delighted to discover this podcast with thoughtful, entertaining call-in discussions on the creative process. Daniel Norton inspires us to make something new in any medium. Let there be art. That's right. Let there be art. All right. So this week I'm going to base my main topic actually on a call. Well, it's actually an email. Graeme sent me this email about ego. So that's going to be our topic this week. So the title is Ego, How to Keep It in Check. And I'm going to read it first, and then I'm going to talk about my thoughts on this and maybe some ideas. Hi, Daniel. I'm not a professional photographer, but I do dabble a little and was recently asked to take some portraits for my company's website. I had a lot of fun doing research, and your videos were incredibly useful to me. However, because I had a very narrow vision of the kind of images I wanted to create, I failed to accommodate sufficiently for such a wide variety of ages and personalities. My small skill set and lack of time played a role in this, but also my ego probably prevented me from capturing images that I considered less interesting, even if they would have been more flattering for the client. So my question is, how to recognize when your ego gets in the way of providing the best images possible for a client? Many thanks for the amazing, down-to-earth, and enjoyable podcast. All the best, Graeme. All right, thanks, Graeme. That was an excellent question, and as you might guess, because I'm making an entire topic out of it, and something that I've dealt with in my own career, and I think a lot of creatives have, this idea that we are hired because of our creativity, right? People look at our portfolio, they look at our work, and they say, well, I want this to be a Daniel Norton or a Graeme, a portrait. And you come into this with this idea that whatever you make is going to be kind of what they want, right? They want your creativity, they want this. But when you're talking about something that's used for, and again, being the company website or this kind of thing, or even if it's something people are going to want for personal use, I'm just going to use the word commercial here as a generic term. Something that is for commercial consumption, meaning that they want an image for a reason. So it might be a high school yearbook picture, or their wedding portraits, or a company photo, or it could be a picture for a catalog, it could be an advertising, whatever type of work you do. This is true in other things too. Obviously, if you're writing a jingle for a company, they have an idea of what they want, right? So even though they like your creativity and they like the things that you're doing, you still have to fit it within the realm of what they are looking for, right? Their use. And this can be difficult for us. And I think that generally speaking, as photographers, because I'm going to try to go from this direction, we want to approach these things with the idea that we're going to look at the most generic possible image that will suit that purpose and make sure that we get that first. I think that's really the issue. What happens is you get in these situations and you think, I'm going to try all these really creative things, but oftentimes all those creative things don't work because you're being creative and inspired by the moment. So not every shot's going to be great, but you're under a time restraint. You've got somebody you've never photographed before, so maybe they're uncomfortable or their personality is more shy, or maybe it's more all over the place and you're doing like very specific lighting. Or you might have people of different age groups that maybe don't like the way they look in certain light types. So usually what you want to do is think about, ideally, ahead of time, the most, what I'll call problematic, like okay, let's say that you're going to photograph somebody who doesn't like to be photographed, that is going to be uncomfortable in the chair, that doesn't, that feels like, I look too old or I look too this or whatever. So you're going to want to think about them first, right? Because that is going to allow you to create that image, because that's going to be the most problematic, right? The other images, the people that are more comfortable in front of the camera, you can start messing around. So what I want to do here is I'm going to get into the exact question, which was really how do we know when we're doing it, but with some steps. But I just wanted to. This immediately reminded me of a story that I will tell you right now. When I first started my career, I moved to Florida, and I wanted to Miami Beach, and I wanted to be a photographer. Of course, I said I'm going to do fashion photography. I was really motivated, and I got down there, and I realized that in order to make money, I'll probably need to work as a photo assistant. So I was looking for work as a photo assistant. I'd put cards up at the labs because that's what we used to do back then. And I got a call one day from a gentleman, and he said, "Oh, I'm such and such for this company, and you want to be a photo assistant." And I said, in my youth, and probably not the right thing to say, although it worked for me. I said, "Well, no, I want to be a photographer." and he said, "Oh, well, in this case, I just need an assistant. So if you're willing to do that for the day, I have this job." So I was like, "Okay, yeah, of course. That's what I needed money, right?" So I went and I met him. Really nice guy. He had been a photojournalist most of his life. Now he had this company that was like a design company. So they did like internal magazines for various companies, one of which was a big HMO company, a big healthcare provider. And we were shooting the cover. So basically we went and we shot, and it was like in this pool at the one of the big hotels in Miami Beach. It was really fun. It was actually, I had to get in the pool with a reflector. So that's a talk for another time. But in any case, we got along. We went to lunch after. We were talking about like my goals and what he had done. And he used me a couple other times as assistant that week because he was busy. And he told me, he said, I have this company and I always need a lot of these photos, and they're usually pretty simple like this, a lot of portraits and stuff. And I can use you for that if you want, we'll give you the opportunity to shoot instead of just assisting, because it'll free me up. And of course it didn't pay a lot. It paid more than assisting, obviously. But I was like, okay, this is not exactly what I want to do, but it's something I can do. And the first assignment they sent me on was to photograph this doctor, and I just had to make a portrait of a doctor. And of course, here I am. I'm going to be a fashion photographer. I'm Daniel Norton. Although back then, what would that even mean? What does it even mean now, right? So I'm like, well, whatever. I'll shoot this doctor, get it out of the way, and make myself a quick few $100s. So I went down there, and these are the days of film. And I made a portrait of the doctor. He was very nice. I made the portrait of the doctor in his office. And then I dropped the film off the lab. And I got a call from this guy, the owner of the company. And he said, "Oh, come down. I want to look at these images with you." And I got there, and he had the contact sheet. And he looks at me. He says, "This may be the worst portrait shoot I've ever seen." And, talk about ego being dropped there, right? And I said, "Huh?" And I looked at the contact sheet. There was a huge shadow on the wall. There was like this weird picture. Like I didn't pay attention to the background at all. The guy himself, he looked lit. The doctor looked lit decently. There was like a really bright area where there was a window. Like it was garbage. It was a terrible, terrible photo. And, technically. And he looked at me and he says, "Well, we go to press in 2 days. I don't know what you're going to say, but you need to call this doctor back and make another appointment to make his portrait and get me that film right away." And in that moment, I thought, oh man, well, he's giving me another chance. That's amazing, because of course I thought, well, that blew that opportunity. At first I was all bold, like, oh, what, portraits. I'm a fashion photographer. Now I'm like, oh man, I'm losing my first client. So I went home. I remember I went back. I was living in Miami. I went home and I went online, or I called maybe on the phone back then, and I ordered what I didn't own to that point, which was a Polaroid back from Adorama. And they shipped it to me overnight, which was very expensive. And I put this Polaroid back on my 35mm camera, because that's what we were shooting. And I went back, because what I realized was I wasn't great at lighting those kind of situations, right? I'm a fashion photographer, and like I'm shooting stuff all in studio that's really very controlled. And I hadn't really been in these like tiny little offices shooting somebody in an environment like this. Is just something I didn't do. And even though I knew a lot about lighting and I knew that I was capable of taking a good portrait, I'd never worked in those kind of environments. So I went back. So I went home, I ordered it, and then I called them up and I said, I made up some excuse. I was like, oh, we really want to make a new image. The film got ruined or whatever. I can't remember what I said. I'm quite sure I didn't say it was the worst photo ever, because that wouldn't give much confidence, right? And I went back and I used the Polaroid, and I thought about all the things that I looked at, the bad image, all the things I did, the shadow on the wall, the bright area, the picture that was weirdly there. And I went into the office and I said, can you give me a few minutes to set up? And he was like, sure, okay. And he went and did whatever he was doing. And I looked for a good angle. I looked for the proper background. I thought about my depth of field. I thought about where the light fell. I thought about all the things I didn't think of before because I was overly confident. And I made a Polaroid and it was beautiful. And I took the shot and I dropped the film off and they had it done, had it processed because it only took a few hours to get film processed. And I went back to the office because I actually hand brought it to the office this time. And we looked at it together and the guy that hired me, he said, okay, not bad. So, and he used me again. And this was like one of my very first clients that I ever had. This is like a regular, I had done jobs for money before, but this is a regular client that hired me a lot. I did all kinds of work for him. I shot all these doctors because once a month they had a doctor feature. So every month I shot a doctor portrait, and then I would shoot like people that were, clients of the HMO, and I would shoot like product stuff. And it became my first real client, and it had nothing to do with fashion. And I learned to keep my ego in check and not think, well, hey, I'm this big fashion photographer and this is below me, because all work is work and we need to pay attention to what we're doing and think about what the client really needs. So all that being said, I made myself some notes here. So all that being said, what we need to do is when we're coming into these situations, is we need to think about the fact that even though we are hired for our vision, we have to weigh that against the expectations of the client. What is the purpose of the image and what is its use? Is it to show off Daniel's great photography, or is it to show a simple portrait of somebody? This comes up a lot in things like actors' headshots, where I sometimes see actors' headshots and I'm just like, that's not a headshot. That's a cool portrait, but it's not a headshot. Headshots are meant to make sure show the actor, they should be really clean. They shouldn't be all kinds of involved with funky little lighting and weird retouching and stuff. It should just be a nice, clean, beautiful picture that captures the personality of the actor. But some people want to use all their latest tools. They want to put their ego into it, and they think they're creating this piece of art, and that's not going to be effective for the actor as a headshot. It might be cool for their Instagram or something, but so we think about these things, right? The other thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we're talking to our client. Now, in my case, that doctor didn't really know what they wanted. I didn't have the Polaroid the first day anyways, so I wouldn't have been able to show them. But these days, we have digital cameras in almost every case, and if you're not shooting tethered, you need to shoot tethered, especially with client shoots. Listen, you don't need to use Capture One, although I recommend that. You can use Lightroom. I don't recommend plugging your camera into a TV. I know I've seen people talk about that before, but TVs are not going to look right. And you want to show people as perfect an image as possible. So don't plug into a TV. Get a laptop computer, even a cheap one, or I don't know, like a desktop, I guess, or even like a nice monitor, like a small monitor like you use for video, and show the client the images. Shoot a few, stop, show them the images. Shoot a few, stop, show them the images. Let them experience the images, watch them, get an idea of if they're liking them. Even if you're under a time crunch, I'd rather shoot less images that I know they're going to like than hammer through a lot just hoping. So we shoot a handful, we let them look. We shoot a handful, we let them look. We get feedback from the client. What we don't want to do is wait till the end and then hope that they like them, right? Because it might be that you shot this whole thing for 20 minutes. Now they're getting ready to leave and they look at their images and they're like, oh man, really? Like my part looks terrible and I can't use any of these because my hair is weird. And you didn't know that. You don't know them, right? We want to make sure that we constantly talk with the client as we're shooting. Not just talk to get them to express, but talk to make sure they're liking the images. And one thing we need to keep in mind is that what's best for the client, that is the best for the use that the client needs at that moment, is not always the best photo. Sometimes the coolest, funnest picture is not the one that's going to be best for the process or the job that you're doing. So keep that in mind when you're doing this. When you're helping the client pick the photo, think about the use again. They might be like, oh yeah, that is a really fun picture where I'm sticking my tongue out, but is that really good for the company, portrait on the website? Probably not, right? You can give them that to put on their own, website or whatever, or on their Instagram, or just a fun secondary picture, but you want to make sure you get the picture that needs to be done for that job. So in the end, we're hired for artistic vision, right? And we want to stick to that on some level, right? We have a certain way that we like to shoot, a certain way we like to interact, but at the same time, we need to think about what it is the client needs. So I'll finish with another story that's kind of the opposite. So I had been shooting for this, a lot of different modeling agencies, because now I was getting more into fashion. This is now fast forward a few years. And I got contacted by an agency that did more kind of like, they did like the swimwear catalogs and stuff like that. So those models were more like shapely fitness models. They weren't like fashion models. And I got contacted and they were like, well, we like your work. We've seen it. and we want to, expand and work with different photographers. So would you like to work with some of our models? We pay this much, blah, blah. And I was like, sure, of course. So I looked at their website, and I saw that all of their images had a certain look to them. They were kind of flat lit, like in the shade on the beach with bright backgrounds. And they weren't at all like what I normally shoot. But I was like, well, I can do that. That's not hard to do at all. So they gave me a couple of models, and I went out and to shoot for the day, and I shot all the pictures, and I basically produced what they more or less had on their website, that same kind of look. And when I went to show the images to the client, she looked at me and she was like, why are you shooting the images like this? Is the portfolio that you showed us that was your portfolio that's on your website and not your work? And I was like, of course it's my work. Why would I put it on my website? And she's like, well, this doesn't look like that. This looks like what we already have. Why would we want to use somebody different? We can get this for the guy we have. And I was like, So again, communication. The client wasn't there. That I didn't really know. I made an assumption. And we don't want to make an assumption. We want to talk to the client. We want to interact with them. And we want to move forward. Now, in the case of going all the way back to this original idea, if you're brought in to hired, I'm just going to use that term, hired to create images for like a company website, you want to talk to whoever is in charge of that, the human resources person or the designer, to know what they need. What are you looking for? Do you want a clean shot of each person? Do you want them to have some kind of wild personality? Do you want it to be more funky? And then once you have that idea, because that's effectively your client, the next step is you're on set with the individual people. We want to think about what they want and not try to overly convince them that what they're saying is not right. We don't want them to look at it and go, oh, I don't really look good there. And you're like, no, you look great. You want to do that because people say stuff like that, but you need to be able to read through and say, okay, no, this person just really isn't happy with this, and they're not going to be happy with it. So I need to figure out why and what's going on here. Start with the most simple thing that you know is going to work with the most people. That is generally flat lighting, kind of standard lighting, 3-point lighting. Make sure you have a fill light that's mostly filling in with just very little shadow. Use a big soft source so that we're not getting a lot of detail. So any of the texture in the face, like could have wrinkles or pimples, that kind of stuff is gone. We want to use nice separation, make it 3-dimensional. You want to use, typically you want to think about your lens choice, right? If we've got somebody who's got more of a wide face and they don't like that, you want to not use a long lens because that's going to make their face feel even wider. You want to get in closer and use a wider lens. These kind of things. If somebody, and vice versa, somebody has like a nose that they feel is large, they don't want it to be expanded, then you want to back up and use a longer lens. So these parts of the photography are the parts we need to think of on the fly with the person that's in front of us. We want to be flexible. I've talked about this before, and I know I'm getting really into photography here, but this is very specifically photography. This is why I use the zoom lens. I know that primes are better. I'm going to get some calls about that, I'm sure. But a zoom lens is great for that exact reason. You want to give yourself room to move, because it's not that you want to zoom in on the person. It's that you want to move yourself physically, so that you can change the way that the camera compresses. And I know that compresses is a loaded word, the facial features, right? We want to start with the flatter light. So we make our image with the kind of flatter light, and then we've got somebody that's got some good shape to their face, or that feels like that you want to experiment. Now you turn your fill light off, right? And now you shoot it with some shadow, more kind of Rembrandt style or something like that. And they might like that, but they might not. And if they don't like it, then you already have the safe images and you're good to go, right? And this is why we want to start with the safe ones. The other reason why starting with the safe is good is because it builds up their confidence. If you start shooting with the funky stuff and then you move to the safe, they're not going to be confident in the safe images. Let them experience a decent picture that is well exposed, that's going to be good for anybody in a more safe look at the beginning. And then start adding your flair in, then, bring some shadows in, and then use a color gel, whatever you want to do to make it a little more funky. Add that. Because I've talked about this many times before where I've been hired to do things, and then at the end I do my own thing and they use that. But the thing is, it's not always that case, right? At least half the time they use the thing that they originally hired me for, and they might like the thing I did at the end, but they want the thing they hired me for. That's why they hired me. So how do we know that our ego is kind of coming forward? Think about, maybe even make a note for yourself what the goal is of the images. And if the client kind of gives any pushback on an image that you're creating, weigh the image that you just created against the goal. So if you are supposed to shoot something all on white, really clean with minimal shadow, and you shoot that, and then the client's like, oh, I don't really like this. Can we change it up? And you look at it and you shot something with minimal shadow on a white background, whatever. then you have to think that, okay, now it's just maybe they need a little bit of encouragement, right, to feel better about the images. If you look at it and, oh no, hold on, the background's gray, or I threw some shadow on their face, or it's a profile, it's supposed to be a headshot, now maybe you got to roll back and say, even though that's a cooler shot and you really like that angle of their face, maybe that's not what they like. Maybe that's not what's correct for the image. So the biggest tips here as far as ego is to make sure that you're constantly in communication with your client, constantly reflecting back to the 1 or 2 sentences that you want to jot down for yourself that describes what you're supposed to be getting. And try to do what is the most, and I hate to say to shoot a generic picture, but when you're doing commercial stuff, it's funny. That's often the case, right? I remember when I first started shooting fashion, you would see these catalog photographers I'd work for, and I'd be like, wow, this work's kind of boring. Really, they hired this person for all this money or whatever. And then you would look at their portfolios and they'd be amazing. And then you start talking to the photographers and they're just like, well, yeah, that's the editorial work I do and the work I used to get this catalog work. But when it's a catalog, right? It needs to have detail. It needs to show the thing. It doesn't need to be the greatest photo in the world. It needs to do the job, which is show the clothing. So in this case, it needs to do the job, show the person for the website, or maybe it needs to do the job and show the detail of a product that you're shooting. You've got to keep in mind what the goal of the job is and always put that before your own ego. And it's funny because I actually appreciate that Graeme wrote in and they're not like saying, oh, I'm a professional, I've been shooting for 50 years. So even somebody that's more of a somebody who does it for fun, a hobbyist, or somebody that's just an amateur, if you want to use that word. I know some people in parts of the world, amateur is considered a compliment, and parts of the world is considered an insult. So I mean it as a compliment. You're a good photographer that does it because you love it, not necessarily because it's your job. Even that kind of photographer can have a little bit of an inflated ego because they know what they like. So all of us need to kind of think about this and say, well, what is it the client wants? How is the client reacting to what we're creating at that moment? And how can we make those things come together in the best way possible to give the client the best experience possible without completely compromising our personal vision? So let me know what you guys think. I would love to hear calls about this, any horror stories where your ego got in the way or maybe didn't, right? Also, if you've got good topics that you want me to talk about, feel free to write me or call me with an idea. And if I think it could be something useful as a main topic, I'll do that. Otherwise, I'll just reply normally. I'll put all the information at the end of the show, and it's in the show notes as to how you guys can call in, leave me a message, or send me a message via email. Before we get to the call-ins, I want to thank the sponsor of this episode, Adorama. You can check them out at adorama.com for any of your photo, video, music, computer, any needs for a creator. Thanks, Adorama. All right, so I've got a nice email here from Mark. It is in reference to the Brands podcast, I imagine, though he doesn't directly say that, but that's what I'm getting from this. There's a lot of he talks about how that he would try to call in the future, and it would be nice if people call in versus send emails. Of course, if email is more comfortable for you or easier, feel free to send me an email. I don't mind reading it. If you call in, though, it's nice to hear other people's voices. In any case, I'm going to cut down to somewhere in the middle here. I think for the podcast, the technical for me is where it meets philosophy. What do I mean? I know you and Vanessa were involved in let's shoot using old cheap gear, and some others have also said it's not about the gear. But at times there's a choice, and I think this may intersect nicely with style. Why something is done technically, not how it's done, but there were X ways of achieving this style photo, and I chose the following technique because, and that because is part of the discussion, as opposed to the technical how-to. And then he talks about Duvetine, which is awesome. So, again, I think this is related to the brands thing, but maybe just as more of a general comment here. And I don't disagree. I think that when we talk about style and creation, well, obviously the tools that we choose to use will affect the results, right? And ultimately, we're trying to produce a certain result. So if we're looking for a certain look, and that requires a certain type of equipment, whether it be oil painting versus watercolor, whether it be a long lens versus a wide angle lens, whether it be using flash or constant light, whether it be choosing our medium at all, like choosing to draw in charcoals versus paint to start off with, right? This is important. And that's where I think gear is important. Where I think what I was trying to talk about the last podcast was the idea when people feel like the brand is more important than the actual gear. That is to say, well, it's not the, Canon 400 millimeter lens, it's the 400 millimeter lens that creates the look that you're going for. Meaning that if you had the Nikon 400 millimeter or the Sony 400 millimeter or the Olympus, you would still get the things that 400mm lenses give you. Yes, I know not all equipment is equal, but I'm just talking about generally as far as vibe, right? So if you are choosing a certain piece of equipment and that is part of your style, that is, you say, well, my style, part of my style is, using these long lenses because of what a long lens brings me, then I'm not going to say that's wrong. I don't think that style is 100% or should be 100% relying on technique, but I do think the techniques we choose do fall into what makes our style. So things intersect for sure. There's not, like most things, there's lots of gray areas. There's very little black and white there. And I think this is a very interesting conversation, but I would love to hear what everybody else has to say there. Do you think that the gear that you use, that is the type of gear, not the brand, is really relevant to your style? Do you think that makes or breaks your style? Do you often say, oh, well, my style is using long lenses? And is that really an accurate way to say it? That would be a really interesting question. I'd love for people to message me or send me more emails and let me know what you think about that. I want to thank everybody who has rated and sent in a review for the show. Podcasts live and die on these things, guys. So if you don't mind jumping on your podcast app and rating the show and ideally giving me a review, I would appreciate that. I will read one a week, as noted. And this week, the review is from Cahill W. 5 stars. Wonderful podcast. Daniel Norton is an always professional and clear explanation on photography. So thanks, Cahill W. I appreciate it. I try to be as clear as possible. As clear as mud sometimes, right? But no, I appreciate it, guys. If you don't mind rating the podcast and leaving a review, like I said, once a week, I shall read a review. So thanks again. I want to thank everyone for listening this week. Thanks to Graeme and Mark for their emails. Thanks to Bashtord for the review. If you guys would like to have your voice on the air, or your words on the air as it would be, you can send me a message using the Anchor app. I will put a link in the show description, as well as you could send me an email at adamavoice@gmail.com. You could attach an audio file, or you could just send me an email and say, read this on the air, and I shall do it. Also, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast server, and I'll talk to you soon.